Kia ora koutou, I'm Lockie Patterson. This is Passion for the Past, NZ. Women have always been an integral part of missionary work with Māori in New Zealand. In the 19th century, their role was as the missionary wife, unpaid workers who supported their husbands, especially working with Māori women and children. And while missionary wives remained an important element in the makeup of mission stations, new opportunities for paid employment emerged in the early 20th century for single women in New Zealand, and they were often called deaconesses. Margaret Tennant, in her writing on the deaconesses of the New Zealand Methodist Mission to Māori, explores the twin contradictions these women faced. First, in both promoting Western ideologies, while also seeking to protect Māori from the extremes of civilization. And second, in projecting the ideal of the independent female missionary, while inevitably working under the direction of male superiors. The three main Protestant churches, Anglican, Methodist and Presbyterian, all employed single women as deaconesses, although the nature of their respective roles differed according to each church. This video looks at the hiring by the Presbyterian Maori Mission Committee, which I'll call the MMC, of its first two deaconesses in its Māori mission, employed in 1907 to work among the Māori in the Taupo area, a move that the committee considered to be a bold experiment. So we're looking at why it decided to employ Jane Spence, also known as Sister Alison, and Mrs. Emare Poroumati as deaconesses, what their actual experiences in the field were like, and how successful this initial trial ended up being. But first, a little broader context. In the 19th century, women were able to take up an increasingly influential moral role within the Protestant church and society. This had its roots in the 18th century with the rise of evangelicalism, a movement that expected a more personal and emotional conversion to Christ, qualities seen as somewhat feminine. Women too could be reborn. By the 19th century, women were increasingly seen, thanks to these innately womanly qualities, to be morally superior to men, and became influential in campaigns of moral regeneration and improvement, even though they may not have questioned the patriarchal norms. These women evangelical campaigners pursued a conservative domestic ideology, seeking to feminize society by getting men to become more family-orientated and to pursue more objectionable masculine habits. And these trends saw the emergence of work for women in the church, eventually including paid work and a cohort of women willing to do it. Now, there are three key factors why careers in the church were an attractive option for late Victorian and Edwardian women. First, a hierarchy of respectability existed for women's roles in the society. In the socially accepted ideal, women were expected to fulfill the domestic roles of wives and mothers. But for as yet unmarried women, careers and jobs perceived to be nurturing and fitting the mother ideal, such as teaching and nursing, were also a respectable possibility. Because female careers in the church often involved teaching and or nursing and other women's work, Protestant women saw a career as a religious worker as a worthwhile option. Second, Olive Banks argues that a prevailing 19th century belief perceived differing sexual drives for men and women. Arousal was natural and spontaneous for men, while some even suggested women had no natural sexual feeling at all. So celibacy for some women was more than just an alternative to accepted patriarchal familial roles, but one that might even be deemed morally superior. Deaconesses were unmarried, and while some did marry and thus had to give up their jobs, many had long careers and maintained the ideal of celibacy to their deaths. Third, Judith Rowbottom notes that the concept of heroism was of great importance in the late 19th century world, especially for women, although this tended to be related to more passive endurance and hardship. Women missionaries began going to Africa in the 1880s, and institutions for training women arose in a number of European countries. Extensive publications on missionary self-sacrifice not only inspired those women who stayed at home, but also motivated others to undertake missionary work themselves. Thus, women were able, as missionaries, to take on respectable feminine roles, to remain sexually pure, and to emulate popular heroic exemplars. The New Zealand Anglican, Methodist and Presbyterian churches followed other churches in English-speaking countries in employing women as deaconesses and in establishing training centres. The scriptural exemplar was Phoebe, found in Romans 16:1. And the Anglican Church appointed probationer deaconesses in 1892, who the following year came under a Mother Edith, a trained worker from London. Although they operated primarily as a community of Anglican nuns, working with women in Christchurch, particularly unmarried mothers. The Methodists voted in principle for a women's mission to Māori women in 1893, although it wasn't until 1908 that 2 women actually began to work in this field. In contrast, the Presbyterians' first foray into employing deaconesses was for congregational work. In 1901, Dunedin's St Andrew's Church hired Sister Christabel Duncan from Melbourne, and at the General Assembly that year, the Auckland Presbytery made an overture in favour of establishing the office of deaconesses in the church, given the, quote, remarkable revival of the apostolic ministry of women at home. The following year, a committee reported noting, with some satisfaction, that an increasing number of our congregations are engaging the services of deaconesses. The report also suggested granting the status of deaconess to the women missionaries already abroad, that is, the several New Zealand women recruited in the 1890s to work in the Scottish Zenana missions in India. So the various presbyteries around the country all gave full and qualified approval to the report recommending deaconesses. The Otago Presbytery had already purchased a private missionary training centre, which they renamed the Presbyterian Women's Training Institute, and in 1901 began offering a 2-year course to prepare young women to become deaconesses for congregational and home mission work, that is, for the many new settlements that were sprouting up, as well as for foreign mission work. But what about the Presbyterian Maori mission work within New Zealand? Well, at this time, the Maori mission was keen to expand as money became more available, although the manpower was in rather short supply. Presbyterian work among Māori has a different history to that of the Anglicans, Methodists and Roman Catholics, whose work started as missionaries before significant Pākehā settlement began. In contrast, the Presbyterian Church was initially established here to serve settlers. It did have a few missionaries to Māori in the lower South Island and Manawatu Rangitikei area, but mainly due to a paucity of funds, the church's efforts were small, sporadic, and piecemeal. When the MMC appointed its first deaconesses, it just had 2 male missionaries in the field. Henry Fletcher had shifted to Taupo in early 1895. He was not particularly successful in garnering converts. But largely due to his efforts, the committee established the Turakina Māori Girls' School in 1905. In 1902, the committee appointed John Egerton Ward as its missionary to Taumarunui. The MMC, based in the North Island, had been chronically short of funds. This improved after 1901, when the wealthier Otago Southland Synod amalgamated with the rest of the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand, and this brought in substantially more donations. In 1902, the MMC reported to the Church's General Assembly that other churches were doing little for Māori in the interior, many of whom were now virtual heathens, and they expressed a wish for a third missionary. Both Fletcher and Ward would have preferred a male. Pākehā had already started moving into Taupo and Taumarunui, but the region was still isolated and the living was difficult and deemed unsuitable for a single woman. And for potential Pākehā missionaries who had probably already formed possibly negative conceptions of Māori, the more exotic China mission appeared far more attractive. In the following year, the Māori Mission Committee displayed its own prejudices about Māori when discussing its difficulty for procuring missionaries. In 1905, Miss Jane Spence, aged 26, enrolled at the Presbyterian Women's Training Institute with a view of working within the Māori sphere. One wonders just how useful much of the curriculum was to the Institute's graduates. In 1905, Miss Spence's first year, students studied the English Bible, theology, scripture biography, church history, comparative religion, and the English language and literature. Of more practical benefit were the art of teaching, lectures on nursing, common diseases of women and children, and food in the alimentary canal, as well as instruction and practical experience of sick visiting, speaking at meetings, etc. Chinese was also available for those going to China. Miss Spence began learning Māori, but as teaching was likely to be her main role, there wasn't a lot of emphasis put on this. Although the MMC had been encouraging, by her second and final year, Miss Spence was getting anxious about her actual employment prospects. She wrote to the committee and also persuaded the head of the Knox Theological College, Professor Hewitson, to also inquire on her behalf. Reverend Robin Ryburn, the convener of the MMC, told them that she would probably work at the new school at Turakina if the school was enlarged. Otherwise, she could work at a native school until a position eventuated. However, it appears that he was perhaps also scoping a role for her at one of the missions. Reverend Fletcher was initially reluctant, but then he wrote to Ryburn saying that there would be a lot of work for Miss Spence and she could live at his mission or at a native school. Ryburn then offered Miss Spence a position as a missionary. However, it is clear, despite women serving as deaconesses within Pākehā communities or missionaries in other countries, MMC considered that any appointment in the Māori field was a trial. Ryburn added in his letter of offer, should the experiment of assisting the missionaries not succeed, there would be the school to fall back on. The only query he had for her was about her abilities with a bicycle. So, what were the three key reasons why the MMC might decide to undertake such an experiment employing women? First, it was difficult to get men to serve as missionaries. In 1906, it only had one man, James Monfries, studying at Knox Theological College with a view to doing Māori work. Second, women were much cheaper than men, paid about half of what a male received. Third, the gendered nature of the church's organisation meant that groups of women had significant discretion over the spending money that they collected. The president of the Presbyterian Young Women's Bible Class Union wrote to the committee saying they were prepared to subsidise Miss Spence as their own missionary. Ryburn accepted the offer, although stressed the experimental nature of the position. Monfries, who was learning Māori alongside Miss Spence, also wrote to Ryburn of meeting with Sister Evelyn of the Bible Class Union. The union was upset that there was an expectation that their funds should be directed solely to the Turakina Girls' School, when they wanted to support a woman missionary, and preferably one of their number among the Māori. Then Monfries himself recommended Miss Spence, saying that a woman with some medical and nursing training, and I understand that Miss Spence is seeking to gain that, would be especially useful in the salvation of the Māori race, body and soul. For good measure, he added, the support is, I understand, as good as assured. It was then just a matter of sorting out the details. Miss Spence, who could ride a bicycle a little, replied to Ryburn, accepting the offer of employment, and stated her preference for home-based work, instructing Māori on hygiene and childcare rather than educational work. Ryburn replied, offering £80 for a year's work. She would stay at the Taupo mission with Reverend Fletcher and his family, and was to visit Māori pa in the district, staying at native schools if necessary. She was to assist Māori and teach them the ways of right living, and to run Sunday schools and scripture classes, and to watch over girls who had attended Turakina to assist them to maintain what they had learned. Ryburn again stressed the experimental nature of this appointment, but should all go well, the job would become permanent. In Taupo, Fletcher was a little concerned that £80 would be insufficient as a deaconess's salary. The cost of living, he said, was high in Taupo, and Miss Spence should receive more, not less, than women missionaries in China. Several times he suggested that the deaconesses should receive at least £100. Now, Fletcher considered himself underpaid, and may have thought that a few pointed digs about the cost of living would keep the issue of his own insufficient salary alive in the minds of the committee. Miss Spence, having finished her training, was ordained in November 1906 by the moderator of the Wanganui Presbytery, and she took the name Sister Alison. The moderator, using the scriptural Phoebe as a model, suggested that the role included raising the fallen, caring for the poor and afflicted, and rescuing little children. This would require not just tact, wisdom and patience, but also winsomeness. She started at Taupo in January 1907. Also in January, a Te Arawa woman, Mrs. Emare Poroumati, wrote to Reverend Fletcher offering her services as a deaconess. Mrs. Poroumati had been an active member of the Salvation Army, writing in Māori and English on occasion to the Salvationist newspaper The War Cry. She had reached at least the rank of sergeant and had toured in the famous Māori Singers, an evangelical Māori concert party, for about 3 years, around the turn of the century. This letter was forwarded to the committee, who then asked for character references. She provided a letter from the Auckland Solicitor's Office and another from Mr. Brent of Rotorua's Brent's Hotel, who suggested that the Salvation Army's success with Māori had been largely Mrs. Poroumati's work. She may have had some connection with the Anglican Church, as a further letter came from Reverend Frederick Bennett of Rotorua's Anglican Maori Mission, stating that while she would be helpful in breaking fallow ground and getting an entrance into a pa or kāinga, the building up process would have to be left in the hands of those who had been more deeply trained in the fundamental principles of our faith. That is, she would be suitable for reigniting interest in Christianity that better trained missionaries could then further develop. Fletcher also wrote that the Taupo launch operator knew Mrs. Poroumati well, and there would be no difficulty arranging accommodation for her at Tokanu, at the southern end of Lake Taupo. The MMC decided to offer her 6 months' work at Tokanu under Fletcher's direction. Ryburn again stressed that this was a trial which will probably lead to a permanent position. His next letter fixed the salary at £80 per annum, just for 6 months, and assured her that the committee will not see you stranded. He warned her that you will probably have problems with Catholics there. However, preach the gospel and do not wrangle with them. So how did the experiment pan out? We can see from this account by Ryburn, soon after Sister Alison's appointment, what he thought Sister Alison was up to. Her own report, part of the Maori Mission's report to the General Assembly in November 1907, was positive and upbeat, as these reports tended to be. She describes her work as largely experimental, caring for the sick, giving home-craft advice, running Sunday schools and sewing classes. However, she hints that systematic work was being hindered by having been shifted around a bit. Now it's clear that the Taupo station was not an easy one. It had largely been abandoned by the Anglicans during the New Zealand Wars 40 years earlier, although they reserved the right to return and reclaim their missions and adherents. Māori there lived on the edge of the New Zealand economy, growing subsistence crops and often migrating for seasonal work. Times were indeed tough, as Sister Alison noted. However, women may well have been an advantage in this work. As Sister Alison stated, she was tolerated because I was a woman who didn't matter much. James Irwin suggests that many of the Māori whom the church ministered to were politically alienated from the Pākehā mainstream. However, they did not see the Pākehā women missionaries as an intrusion or a threat, and valued them for the skills that they brought. Sister Alison's principal problem, however, was not with the Māori, but with her immediate superior, Reverend Henry Fletcher. The MCC had been happy for Sister Alison to board with the Fletcher family in Taupo, but stressed that she should devote all her time to Māori work. But you are to be under the general direction of Mr. Fletcher in the position of a deaconess to a minister. She wrote back in May saying that she was paying 10 shillings per week, which was almost a third of her salary, staying at the manse, plus doing some housework. And she was optimistic that now that she had a bicycle, she could devote all of her time to her work. But she had discussed board with a teacher at Waitahanui, which would be £1 a week. It was clear that Sister Alison's relationship with Reverend Fletcher was far from harmonious. In April, she wrote to the Outlook, the leading Presbyterian newspaper, requesting that people send her cooking utensils, clothing, material for sewing, and basic medical supplies, as medicine is not easily procurable here. Fletcher fired off a missive to the MCC, taking great umbrage at the accuracy of the latter statement. The committee again instructed her to defer to the minister. By June 1907, about half a year of having lived with the Fletchers, Sister Alison was now boarding at Waitahanui, but tensions with Fletcher persisted. That month she wrote to the MCC requesting several tents so that she could have a place to nurse her Māori patients. This caused further ructions with Fletcher, who sent a flurry of letters objecting. He was aware that should a Māori patient die in a tent, it would become tapu, and all other patients would refuse to enter it. He implied that Māori would not have confidence in Sister Alison, and stated that using tents would mean that she would have to live at pa at times, which ran counter to the agreement that women missionaries should never be allowed to live in a Māori pa. He felt aggrieved that she'd gone behind his back, and stated, I wish the committee to make some other arrangement, re the employment of Miss Spence. She is not the person I would choose for work among the Māori. Sister Alison fought back. In later August, she wrote several letters to the MCC, laying out her grievances, backed by another letter from Mr. Harmon, the schoolmaster at Waitahanui. Although I couldn't find those letters in the archives, Ryburn's reply was there, and it clearly indicates his sympathy for the deaconess. We knew that there was trouble, and I think the executive at least has come to the conclusion that you could not continue with Mr. Fletcher. But it's also our opinion, at least it was mine, that our experiment of a Maori deaconess was not, therefore, a failure. It appears that Fletcher did not introduce her to any Maori people and initially expected her primarily to be a lady help to Mrs. Fletcher with the housework. Ryburn asked Sister Alison to attend the next committee meeting to put her case and assured her that the committee would not pronounce you incompetent without hearing you, concluding with, "We have much sympathy for you." He then wrote to Fletcher to say that he thought that Sister Alison had done her best and recommended that he take a fortnight's complete rest immediately. If the MCC wanted to persevere with this experiment, the next option was Ward's station at Taumarunui. Ward had already stated that he was not keen on having a deaconess. He was again reluctant, saying that he'd heard that Sister Alison had a habit of attacking other denominations. However, he recommended placing her at Tiroa, a remote timber town well away from his Taumarunui base. Ryburn wrote a blistering defence, explaining that all the problems arose from misunderstandings over how much housework Sister Alison was required to do, and Fletcher had done little to facilitate her work with Māori. The executive sympathised with Miss S. She is capable, energetic and common sense, and very desirous of helping the Māoris. Sister Alison agreed to shift to Tiroa. Ryburn wrote to her, restating the MCC's confidence in her and to ignore anything to the contrary. He added that he would tell Fletcher that as a Christian gentleman he should do his best to stop such reports and to ask him to say nothing about you as I ask you to say nothing about him. Sister Alison left the Taupo area soon after and spent the best part of the next 40 years as a deaconess to the Maori Mission in the King Country, and she retired fully in 1946. Mrs. Poroumati's experiences proved quite different to Sister Alison. She arrived brimming with enthusiasm and initially boarded with the schoolmaster's family at Tokanu. Fletcher was impressed with her prayer at the first service, offered by a Māori in a way that few Europeans can hope to attain to. By a Māori, for and on behalf of Māoris, and in their own tongue. As a Māori woman, she was quickly able to make contacts with Māori in the area, to whom she preached in a revivalist manner, perhaps reminiscent of her Salvationist past, as she wrote to Ryburn. After preaching, I asked those who would choose the devil for their master to put up their hands. Not one response. But when they were asked to testify for Jesus as their master to put up their hands, there were about 30 out of 40. It was clear from their reports to the assembly that the two deaconesses operated differently. Both made home visits and cared for the sick, but Sister Alison's report stressed the women's work aspect of her activities, her various sewing classes and visits, and meekly concluded with a request for people's prayers for God's blessing of her work, however faulty and inefficient. In contrast, Mrs. Poroumati wrote of her services, ending confidently with, "The seed has been put forth, and we trust that before long it will bear fruit to his honour and glory." Despite her initial self-assurance, Mrs. Poroumati was effectively isolated in Tokanu, a situation that probably would have suited Sister Alison, when she really needed some support. She made several requests for a horse so she could visit nearby kāinga, but had to rely on borrowing one from local Māori. She could not find a house to rent at Tokanu, staying at the schoolhouse until the committee, after pleas from her and Fletcher, eventually built her a cottage on some leased land the following year. Tokanu was a poor Māori settlement, as Mrs. Poroumati's report shows. And within a few months she began to feel discouraged. Fletcher instructed her to continue God's work. She continued with few complaints for another year, but again felt compelled to feed hungry Māori, even if she herself went without, which led her to become more dispirited and physically run down. "The work suddenly has been very heavy on me, both spiritually and financially. The cost of living here is very dear, and the Māoris are almost starving. The sick I often find to live on tea without milk, bread without butter, potatoes with nothing else. One can't feel but to deny oneself to give milk and butter and fish and meat and fruits and oil, etc. Quite often I'm called out of bed to go to the sick. This I find really hard with a touch of the same complaint. I often feel afraid of getting really ill. I feel very much run down, and while I stop here I cannot have proper rest. I feel I must go out and help my people. Fletcher acknowledged that she was spending her own money on feeding Māori. The MCC said they could authorise a small fund for food, although she was not to be put upon, so long as she kept an account of expenses. This was something she seemed unable to do, and in August 1908 an influenza epidemic hit Tokanu, made worse by complications from the poor living conditions. Sickness was widespread for several months with a number of deaths. Mrs. Poroumati coped with this with occasional visits from Dr. Peter Buck, also known as Te Rangihiroa, although the problems were exacerbated by a land court sitting which compelled more Māori to reside in the settlement, many who camped in very unsanitary conditions. Despite her problems, Fletcher didn't lose confidence in Mrs. Poroumati. After a well-earned break over summer, during which she took a 6-week course of treatment from an electrotherapeutist in Rotorua, she returned in March. Fletcher talked to her, and among other things I advised her to put more system into her daily work, to have regular meals and regular habits, and not to venture out too much in the dark, wet nights. When Sister Alison received a salary increase, Fletcher wrote to the MCC convener stating how unfair it was that Mrs. Poroumati was being paid less when she was more useful than Sister Alison. It does not seem a fair thing to give Miss Spence £100 and Mrs. Poroumati £80. The latter had some work with the Salvation Army before she came to us. The language she uses is her mother tongue. I question whether Miss Spence can address the Māoris in fluent Māori. I raise no objection whatsoever against £100 to Miss Spence. In fact, would rejoice if it were more. But I do object to Mrs. Poroumati receiving only £80. Despite Fletcher's support, Mrs. Poroumati's tenure was about to be terminated. In June 1909, the MMC decided to restructure its missions by closing the whole Taupo operation, mainly due to Fletcher's lack of converts. As a deaconess under the minister, Mrs. Poroumati's job at Tokanu was to close, although with a possibility of a transfer to Taumarunui. It appears that Mrs. Poroumati decided to leave of her own accord, although, according to Irwin, Reverend Ward had declined to take advantage of a second deaconess. Fletcher fought to keep his position at Taupo, arguing that if mission work is to be judged by tabulated results over a short term of years, then the whole of Māori work stands condemned, for definite results are the exception, not the rule. After a year of deliberation, the MMC finally expressed their confidence in Fletcher's role at Taupo. After leaving the Presbyterians, Mrs. Poroumati soon found new fields. The MCC minutes record that it was stated that Mrs. Poroumati was now working for the Methodist Church, and that from her station at Tikuiti she was visiting Sister Alison's district and therein circulating reports in connection with her former engagement with the committee. The convener was to communicate with the Methodist officials to stop this intrusion. In a 1922 article in the Anglican newspaper Te Toa Takitini, it is clear that Mrs. Poroumati was still actively preaching, although it's unclear if she was acting independently or connected to any particular denomination. According to Salvation Army sources, she returned to that denomination and died in 1940. In both cases, the initial experiment might be judged a failure. Fletcher was unhelpful, perhaps even obstructive, with Sister Alison. He didn't introduce her to Māori communities, and they fell out over how much housework she was to do as his boarder. The relationship between the male minister and the female deaconess was structured unequally, which could often lead to friction. As Margaret Tennant points out, women missionaries were expected to demonstrate physical and mental strength, independence and adaptability, preferably with professional skills in nursing and teaching, yet were still subordinated to males. It's clear that Reverend Fletcher in 1907 was attempting to impose his authority upon his deaconesses. Sister Alison's subsequent career as a missionary does not paint her as obstructive or rebellious. She served in or around Taumarunui under male ministers for the next 4 decades, during which time most other deaconesses, such as Sister Jessie at Nuhaka and Sister Annie at Ruatahuna, were opening up and running new mission stations in even more remote areas. Her resistance to Reverend Fletcher was thus a localized event, due to the conflict between her perceived duty to the MCC to spend her time working among the Māori people and Fletcher's expectation of her becoming his wife's domestic servant. Although Mrs. Poroumati came to her substation brimming with confidence, especially in comparison with Sister Alison's diffidence, she does not appear to have challenged Fletcher's authority in any substantial way. In late 1907, Mrs. Poroumati did write to the MCC, implying that Fletcher had not given her sufficient direction in how to deal with the Anglicans. She perhaps felt she had overstepped the mark, as Fletcher soon after wrote to the committee saying that Miss Spence has been worrying her to send that letter, a letter that he claimed that Sister Alison had drafted and that Mrs. Poroumati had since regretted sending. It's strange because the two women, from what I could tell, didn't have a lot to do with each other, but it perhaps suited Fletcher to criticise the deaconess whom he'd already squabbled with and who was about to leave than the one that was going to stay. It's also ironic that Fletcher came to dislike Sister Alison, who as a trained deaconess adhered to the preferred nurturing role of women's work and who appeared to be reasonably efficient, but supported Emare Poroumati, who exulted in public preaching but was a poor administrator. It seems that Sister Alison was not prepared to be sufficiently domestic in the manse, whereas Mrs. Poroumati was either suitably respectful of Fletcher's authority or knew how to handle him. Certainly Fletcher did not want to pass on the bad news of her sacking and insisted that the convener have responsibility. Mrs. Poroumati was dismissed largely for reasons that were beyond her control. The committee failed to adequately support and monitor her as she became physically and mentally run down, serving a Māori community under stress of starvation and sickness. This may have contributed to her inability to keep receipts and her failure to furnish an annual report in 1908. However, it is because of the overall poor performance of the Taupo station under Fletcher's control in garnering converts that she was dismissed, and this was unfair. As Irwin points out, Māori at the time were disinclined to change denomination, and Anglicans made sporadic visits performing baptisms and confirmations in order to maintain a nominal flock. Mrs. Poroumati was also relatively exposed as an untrained Māori worker who had come in from another denomination. In contrast, Sister Alison was lucky that her spat with Fletcher arose at a time when the Taupo station was not in danger, but more importantly that she had influential contacts with Presbyterian women's groups, such as the Women's Training Institute, the Presbyterian Women's Missionary Union, and the Women's Bible Class, none of which would have wanted their woman missionary to have been sacrificed. Mrs. Poroumati suffered the further indignity of being written out of most Presbyterian mission histories. Her name does not appear in J.N. Smith's Upon Them the Light Hath Shined, J.G. Lawton's From Forest Trail to City Street, or J.R. Elder's History of the Presbyterian Church, whereas Sister Alison is generally remembered as the Māori mission's first deaconess and the advance guard of a noble band of women workers who in station after station have done pioneering work comparable, if not in extent, certainly in quality, to that of Mary Slessor of Calabar and Christina Forsyth of Fingerland. Indeed, manpower, that is, willing male recruits, were still in short supply. Following this initial experiment, the Presbyterian Maori Mission underwent significant growth before the Second World War. establishing 15 further stations between 1913 and 1934. All but one of these were initially established by women missionaries who were given considerable autonomy in running their own work. This is a story I hope to discuss in the near future. Ngā mihi.